Yeah, now it's my great pleasure to announce our second keynote speaker today, and she will come back to the concrete, practical part. I think Eleni Gabre Madhin, there's a lot to say, but it's once again a personal connection. I read early about her achievements in Ethiopia when she built up the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange, and I invited her to be a guest speaker in my course at ETH Zurich, or at the University of Zurich. There were 100 students, and they were expecting, oh, look, someone from Ethiopia, we have to give her advice. And then they realized she actually knows much more than we do. And the fact is, she graduated also with a PhD from Stanford University, but she was frustrated with the social sciences, who are just basically busy with themselves. They don't really are connected anymore to solving real problems. So she thought, I do it differently. She went back to Ethiopia, and what she achieved is really unique in enabling more than 4 million small-scale farmers to get a decent price for their surplus production. And then she became one of the leading startup investors in Africa. Now she's an executive in residence at Georgetown University. She was also Chief Innovation Officer of UNDP. So it's really, and she was invited to the to the G8 summit by Obama. So she's really, in my view, one of the celebrities that deserve to be a celebrity. And it's also what I tell to my students, look, the best ideas for development come from these countries because they know this context much better than you do. And she's a great example to prove this. Thanks a lot, Eleni, to join us.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Excuse my raspy voice. Zurich has given me a bit of a cold, so thank you for that, Switzerland. But I'm so excited to be here today. I don't know if this is the right place to stand, but I think I'm going to stand here. That's okay. So thank you, Philip, for that wonderful introduction. I would say that's one of the most really very touching and insightful introductions. People just usually read by bio, but Philip really spoke from the heart. And I think he's absolutely right. When you're closer to the problem, you probably understand it better. That's kind of obvious. But when you have the opportunity to apply the knowledge that you've gained, if you're lucky enough to access the best institutions in the world, then you have a responsibility to do something about it. And that's been my life philosophy and what I've tried to pass on to my now young adult sons, who are themselves, forging forward in the world, since there were a few people on this panel. And I love the fact that even though it was a manel, this last panel, there was discussion about one's children. So that was kind of cool. So that said, I am going to talk to you about what happened after I founded and ran the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange, which was the first of its kind in Africa, that achieved $1.4 billion annual trading after 3 years of operations. That went from 1 commodity warehouse to 55 in 3 years. And that eventually impacted the livelihoods of 15 million smallholder farmers, particularly in the coffee sector, whose share of the final export price went from 38% to above 70%. And so that was probably why the world, the global media picked up this story. It became something of a thing. I was interviewed by almost every major media in the world. PBS made a film about this whole story called The Market Maker. I believe there was a BBC documentary about it as well. And then, as Philip mentioned, I was invited to address G8 leaders at the 2012 Camp David G8 summit on the topic of whether this kind of innovation, it's not a complete innovation because we've had commodity exchanges for centuries, starting with the Tokyo Grain Exchange and, of course, the grandfather of them all, which is the Chicago Board of Trade. So it wasn't the fact that nobody had thought about it, but it was really about how to do it in a way that would work for Africa, and specifically for the Ethiopian context. Just to back up a little bit before I start talking about this, the reason I was able to think about how to adapt it and really, solve that problem was first of all because I, went all over the world. I was lucky enough. I went to China to visit the Dalian Commodity Exchange, India, in Mumbai, the Multi Commodities Exchange, Matba in Argentina, SAFEX, which is the Johannesburg Stock Exchange derivatives arm, commodity derivatives arm, as well as the Chicago Board of Trade and the London Metals Exchange. And so taking all of this sort of thinking, one of the things that I think also I had the advantage of was that I'd spent most of my career as a researcher. I used to work for IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. I'm an agricultural economist by training. And I was very influenced by a talk I heard by Yujiro Hayami, if you know him, the late Japanese agricultural economist who referred to himself as a pedestrian economist. And he said, everything I've ever worked on came from walking and talking to real people about real problems. And I thought that was brilliant, and that's the kind of economist I wanted to be, not the kind that could fill up pages and pages with Greek symbols, which I can do too, and which I did for my dissertation, obviously. But that wasn't the kind of economist I wanted to be. I wanted to be the kind of economist that would actually solve real problems for real people. So I was in Mali doing my master's research. I went all over Mali, riding on the backs of trucks, following the supply chain of how a sack of grain went from the farmer that produced it all the way to the end market. And I traced these chains from, rural area, from producer areas all the way to the border with Senegal and Mauritania and Burkina and Cote d'Ivoire. And kind of came back with this methodology, which I, and informally called a month in the life of a sack of maize, sort of based on the, day in the life of Ivan Ivanovich. And so the idea was, how do you trace up what happens to the produce? And so that led to an understanding, and it really came because I was sitting on sacks of grain, waiting to interview the traders as they were transacting, and I was this little, student waiting to do the interview, and I would notice that every time a sack changed ownership, a grain changed ownership, or let's say a truck full of grain changed ownership, all the grain had to be offloaded, resacked, and then put back on another truck, which was the buyer's truck. And I kept asking, why are you doing that? Why are you taking it off, emptying it into a new sack, the buyer's sack, and then sewing it up again? All this takes so much time, so much handling. So I tried to estimate what that cost was, and it ended up being 36% of the marketing margin was purely handling costs. And why that was is because, so I kept asking this question over and over. And then after Mali, I did surveys in 9 other countries around Africa. And I kept asking, and I saw the same thing, kept asking the same question. And the answer always was, well, this is how we do it, because how else would we know what we're going to buy? How else do we know what we're getting? So we can't know whether it's a sack full of stones or sand or actual real grain unless we resack it. So in other words, it's a grading and standardization problem. It's not some sort of culture or tradition. It's a real problem that there's no grading and standard institution. So that sort of started, me thinking about institutions in general and why it is that we can have e-commerce or anonymous trade between people that don't know each other or are related to each other. How do you build trust? And that really came from all the institutions that, for payment systems, for grading and standardization, for weighing, for market information, all of these things that sort of are the institutions that drive trade. So all of that is what enabled this innovation of the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange that basically was a spot exchange that mimicked a futures exchange. And that's, if you ever want to know what was the secret that made ECX what it became, that's basically it, is this idea that we can do for the physicals market what we do for the derivatives market, because we're not ready for a derivatives market, and everybody that tried to set up derivatives markets failed around the continent, but we hadn't yet solved the spot market or the physical market problem, and so that's what I tackled. And as I was doing that, I realized that technology, and now I will come to the topic at hand, technology was really the driver. We tried to acquire technology. I think there's even a company we talked to here in Switzerland, but certainly a company called Pat Systems, which is a British tech company. There was an Indian tech company that we talked to, South African tech company. So the idea was, we're doing this exchange in a unique way. We're doing it in a way nobody's ever done before. It's going to have a warehouse receipt system. It's going to have a clearinghouse. So all these things that other exchanges don't have to do, because markets already have those problems figured out, we were going to do ourselves. So it's really 5 different businesses we were trying to build under the guise of a single commodity exchange. And so they kept telling us, oh, well, we'd have to build you a whole new technology. There's no such, technology off the shelf. So in 2007, in the middle of our project phase, I made the crazy and bold decision that we would build it ourselves. So I brought in an IT engineer, an Ethiopian American from Accenture in the US. And then he hired a group of young Ethiopian software developers, a team of about 20. And we built the technology that became the backbone of the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange. Later on, a few years later, we got, for the first time ever in Africa, the CIO 100 Award of IT excellence. And our promise to the market was that we were building a zero default market. That in a country that didn't have a real, what is that, RTGS, real-time, whatever it stands for, the electronic switch between banks, we didn't have that in Ethiopia. We had one government monopoly telecom company that was extremely imperfect. We promised real-time data, passing on electronic price stickers all the way to the farmer markets, rural markets in 200 sites around the country. We promised T+1 trading, clearing and settlement, meaning one day after trade, we would clear and settle payments in a continent where Johannesburg Stock Exchange was T+3, Nigeria Stock Exchange was T+3, Dar es Salaam was T+5. So in other words, we were outsized. We had outsized ambitions in a country with very limited infrastructure and institutions, and we did it because of the way we built the technology with local talent. And so that led me to really get excited about technology, and post exchange, I set up another company to build exchanges in 7 other countries around Africa. And then after that, I came back to Ethiopia. I said, I really want to focus on working with youth on innovations that can move the needle, move us forward as a continent. And so that's really what I've been working on for the last few years. Get my clicker. And so that's what I want to talk to you about, is something that's been happening over the last decade, and especially since 2018, which is Africa's rise in the global startup ecosystem. And that's actually what I work on now at Georgetown. I'm at the business school as an executive in residence, as was said, which basically is a wonderful position. It's sort of a position where I'm asked to think about Africa's, position in global business, and to inform the Georgetown community, and to run, events and seminars and so on. So it's not really a teaching position. So one of the things we've been working on is putting together an Africa Business Forum that would actually focus on Africa's emergence in global tech. And so that's something that I'm excited to talk to you about. So let's start with the first thing, which is demographics. Let me go back, sorry. I don't know if you saw this last year. This was a New York Times article called "The World is Becoming More African." And it was really talking about the demographics of where we're going. And this is probably not unfamiliar to you, but it bears repeating because it matters for everything else I'm going to say. The median age on the African continent, as you probably have heard, is 19, which is obviously much, much lower than anywhere else in the world. And what that means, particularly if you compare to the Indian subcontinent, which is, I believe, 27, Europe, which is 46, Japan, also in the 40s. So what does that mean? That means that more than a third of the world's youth by 2050 will be African. Africa is the only region in the world where the share of the population that's aged 15 to 24 is rising compared to everywhere else where it's declining. So by 2050, 1/4 of the global population will be African, 1/3 of youth will be African, and very importantly, 1/2 of the labor force would be African. Now, if I'm sitting in Europe, as most of you are, I would be a little bit worried about what that means. Does that mean there are going to be more boats, more people, drowning in the Mediterranean? Or are we going to change this somehow? Because we have to change this. The whole world is going to be destabilized or incredibly enhanced by how we address what we need to do about these numbers. So let's talk about startups and technology and innovation and entrepreneurship. And even before I get to this slide, let me just say, before even talking about tech startups, let me say something that you might not know, which is that Africa is the most entrepreneurial continent in the world. Forget about technology and innovation, just the mom and pop shops, the people selling vegetables on the stand. 28% of Africans have started a new business in the last year. So that's a staggering number compared to, I think, around 10 or 11% in most of the rest of the world. So Africans already are quite entrepreneurial, but what's been happening over the last, like I said, a little bit less than a decade, 8-9 years, is that Africa has been exploding in the startup sector. When I talk about startups, I'm not talking about SMEs. I'm talking about innovation, scalable, tech-enabled startups or companies. And so Africa's growth rate is the highest in the world. And as I said, this is really something phenomenal, really that took off around 2018, 2019. If we look at it in a few other ways, the number of companies growing dramatically, number of deals, the average or median deal value, all rising quite dramatically. Now, there are hotspots. It's not uniform. So not every country is going through this. I was really struck yesterday by the keynote from China, a keynote speaker that mentioned that every town in China was trying to develop its own Silicon Valley. I see a little bit of that starting to happen in Africa, but at the moment, I think there is a concentration in about 5 or 6 places: Cairo, Nairobi, Johannesburg. More Cape Town, but now increasingly Johannesburg, Lagos and Accra, Dakar, Casablanca, and Tunis. There are others. Lusaka is now emerging as a new hotspot. Côte d'Ivoire, Abidjan is emerging as a hotspot. So just like whether it's the US or Europe, you don't have, every single city having a Silicon Valley. And even in the US, for example, which I'm a lot more familiar with, you have cities competing for this Silicon Valley status. So you have the mayor of Miami declaring that Miami is going to become the next Silicon Valley, and Austin, Texas, and Boston, Massachusetts are all vying for this top position. Same thing is happening in Africa. Presidents are declaring, including from my own country, Ethiopia. Prime Minister gets up and talks about how we're going to become the top startup, nation. And everybody looks especially at Israel, which as a tiny country, has more startups doing IPOs on NASDAQ, twice as many than all of Europe combined. This little country, Israel. So everybody's excited by what Israel did. Everybody's excited by what Singapore did, which emulated what Israel did. So, we're all looking at these examples saying, how can we be part of this adventure? So that's what's happening. And I want to also just mention, just to highlight a few of the unicorns that are emerging. We still don't have as many unicorns as we should, but we will. I'm very bullish about what's happening on the continent. But these are a few that have emerged. I think now there are about 10 unicorns, but the first one and the most famous one is Flutterwave. Sorry, it's not the first one, but the biggest one. This is a Nigerian company, an MIT-trained engineer, went through Y Combinator in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, and then went back to Nigeria to set up a fintech company, now valued. Actually, this is a little bit dated. It's about 5 billion, the value of the company. Chipper Cash roommates, a Ugandan and a Ghanaian, who were at Grinnell College, which I believe is somewhere in the American Midwest, I think Iowa, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know, somewhere in the Midwest. So they, again, had this idea, hatched the idea on a college campus in the US, went to not Y Combinator, which is the top incubator in the world, but to another incubator called 500 Startups, got initial seed funding, went to Ghana, Nigeria, and launched the company. And if you look at the impact of what these even just these two companies have had in terms of fostering peer-to-peer payments between SMEs, between small businesses, between people across borders. I mean, way more impact than, and when I was talking to the UN about what I ended up doing with UNDP, as Philip mentioned a couple of years ago, this was sort of my thesis is, NGOs have been trying to work on financial inclusion for decades, and just two people in their 20s have done more in 2-3 years than all the NGOs combined. So this is the power of what we can do in this space. So I think this has probably been said before, but I used to say this to my startups all the time in Ethiopia, which is, first thing is to fall in love with the problem. And know more about that problem and understand how to solve that more than anything else. And I know this was, exactly the case in my own life. And these problems are big problems. We have problems that can be, ascribed to almost every SDG. If we were to, I'm not a big fan of SDGs, but if that is the construct we're going to use to talk about how to change people and planet, then, then we certainly can find almost a correspondence between so much of what's happening with startups, especially in the African continent, because people are living problems. When I was incubating startups in Ethiopia, I had an agri-tech incubator, as I mentioned, after my work on exchanges. And, I would always ask, how did you think about this idea of, a solar-powered sonic device to repel birds from the field? And he said, because I was and the entrepreneur would tell me, because I was a kid swatting, chasing birds. And I had to stay home from school, especially during, the harvest season, because I had to get rid of the birds. So I figured there must be a better way to do this. So I lived the problem. And I would hear this over and over. And so this is really, something that I think is key. So while I was at UNDP as Chief Innovation Officer for the Bureau for Africa, I developed this project called Timbuktu, which we launched exactly 2 years ago at Davos, which is $1 billion venture fund to address the African innovation ecosystem. And the approach we took was to capture, or to, let's say, leverage the hotspots that I referred to earlier, and to try to put in a specific venture fund that was sector-focused, mapped to different locations on the continent. So you have green, climate, energy in Nairobi, trade, logistics, commerce in Cairo, and so on. Fintech, obviously Lagos, which is where the big fintech companies are very highly concentrated, and so on. So that still is happening. It's still going on, and I left that and joined the faculty at Georgetown. But these are some of the things that I wanted to give you a flavor of, that are happening on the continent. I deeply believe that tech-powered innovation will drive Africa's future, and that basically now, if I were to concentrate a little bit on something of a little bit more interest to you here in this particular conference on sustainability and climate and so on, is really what we're looking at, which is the power of agri-tech, and I've spent a lot of time focused on this both with my incubator, but earlier also with the exchange and so on. And just to, this is actually some work done on what's happening in Silicon Valley, because agri-tech is attracting more funds, agri and climate tech, because now increasingly it's kind of converging. But technology above ground, on the ground, below the ground, irrigation, water management, robotics, drones, etc. So there's so many different aspects of agri-tech, and it is the fastest growing venture capital backed sector. Some of the additional innovations are related to the previous slide, would be around satellite imagery, field monitoring, soil health, and I've incubated companies in all of these areas in Africa. Agricultural robotics, as well as predictive analytics, and there's a lot of that going on. So this all sounds great, but I want to also have a little bit of a balanced view on these trends. So the first is that despite all this optimism, the rapid growth, maybe I even forgot to mention that 2021, Africa's venture capital growth was 6 times the global average. And this is despite the fact that between 2020 and 2021 were bonanza years for startup VC funding, 92% growth globally, but in Africa, it was above 300% growth. In 2023, 22, 23, 24, there was global stagnation, and still Africa was holding its own with more of a dip in the 2024-25 phase. But despite all of that, Africa's share of global startup value is still only 0.2%. So for a banker, I would be looking at that. That means a lot of upside. It's still possible. Africa's share of global trade value is 2%. So startup values is 1/10 of that. So we're very, very far behind where we can go. Second, and this is a very important point, is that 83% of Africa's venture capital, including, by the way, not just traditional VC, but also grant capital, competition prize money and all of that, 83% of funding going into startups is foreign capital. There's no region in the world that has grown its innovation economy with that much dependence on foreign capital. And yet, if you come to the city I was born in, Addis Ababa, you'll see cranes and buildings being, going up like nobody's business. So there is capital. It's just not going into innovation. It's not going into this high-risk sector. And that's because, and I believe somebody, I think it was Roland, in the last panel said, I don't like to work much with governments. Well, one of the things governments have done everywhere else where innovation has thrived is they have de-risked investing into innovation. And that's what African governments must do, because there's no other way that we can attract domestic capital if the perception and the lack of understanding is where it currently is. So this number has to change if we're going to actually enable Africa to increase its share of global startup value and close that gap. The other issue, and by the way, what else happens when you have this much reliance on foreign capital is because foreign capital is extractive by its very nature. All capital is, but particularly foreign capital has a limited duration, less patient, more extractive, looking for quick wins. And, I've talked to people who have funds, coming from Europe or Asia or US, and they usually will tell you, I find startups, at the local watering hole. There's a place where all the great founders, we can find them. And, there's this old boys network, but, redefined into the current way of doing business. But the main point I'm trying to make is this is particularly why you find it's a lot easier for everybody to cluster around Nairobi, where everybody else is, and so they could talk to each other, kind of mitigate risk that way. They can invest in things that other people have invested in. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why this this big number of foreign capital introduces a lot of bias into the way that the innovation ecosystem is unfolding, and that has everything to do with the next issue or concern, which is that 87% of capital going into startups is concentrated in the big four. Nigeria, in the order of importance. Nigeria, South Africa, it changes, Kenya, Egypt, in that order. So that's where most of the capital is going. And that has to do with the fact that most of it is foreign capital, and most people want to go where all their friends are going. So there's a lot of expats in these four places. They all talk to each other. That's where the capital is. So there's nothing going on in Burkina Faso or in, some other place. So that's an issue. And a corollary to that is that 63% is going into one sector, which is fintech, because that's a quick win. Of course, it's a good thing that we're investing first in fintech, because fintech is the basis for many other things. But nonetheless, that is an issue when you think about, investing in health tech or edutech or all the other things that we need to focus on. And then the final thing is a statistic put out by the Tony Blair Institute that there's a $90 billion funding gap between from now to 2030. So we need to close this gap. We don't have enough domestic capital. This perception of risk that leads to concentration in, a few places, which leads to less ability to engage with, the global economy. So the challenge is there. So my question is, and this is the question I am driven by, is can Africa be the next tech superpower? And I think we can, of course. That's why I'm here, to tell you that. But we have to address and focus on 5 priorities, in my view. The first is how to mobilize, increase, and spread, diffuse, let's say, early stage risk capital. And that is a question of how can governments, public sector, work with private sector. That was exactly the idea of this fund that I set up, and others that are also in play. So it's not the only one. The second is how to align the ecosystem. Many things that I learned running this incubator in Ethiopia was how fragmented the innovation ecosystem itself was. Philip mentioned that I was at Stanford. I was at Stanford exactly the same time that a couple of guys called Sergey Brin and Larry Page were also PhD students. At the same time that I was a PhD student, they were over in the engineering department. And with their advisor, came up with the algorithm that cracked the previous search engines like Bing and Yahoo and built an incredibly powerful search engine called Google. And their advisor, an Indian guy called Rajiv Motwani, all of them became billionaires, obviously, including the professor and including Stanford that got some royalties from this. So in other words, you can't talk about Silicon Valley without talking about Stanford. You can't talk about what's happening in Israel without talking about Ben Gurion University or Tel Aviv University. You can't talk about what's happening in Europe without looking at what's happening in Delft. Or, I'm sorry, I'm not as up on, the European innovation ecosystem. But in other words, and same thing with Singapore National University. So in other words, universities are part and parcel of the innovation ecosystem. And yet, most of Africa does not have this kind of vision that the universities should be engaged in downstream commercialization. They don't have tech transfer programs. They don't have incentives for faculty to engage in, projects with their students or to advise in companies started by students. So this is something I've been working on a lot. That's one aspect. The other is corporate R&D. There was a gentleman yesterday, I believe, from Buehler, and I asked him a lot about corporate innovation. I'm fascinated by corporate innovation because I believe that that's another huge driver, which again is a missing link in Africa. So I could go on for a while, but let's just say aligning the ecosystem is something I'm deeply engaged in. The other is the size of market. We have 54 fragmented economies, and yet the ambition to start a One Africa market, which is $3.2 trillion, the largest free trade area in the world. It's an unpronounceable acronym, AFCFTA, African Free Continental Trade Area. So that's something that if we can realize would be a huge impact for this ambition. Harnessing AI. I'm working right now with a project with the World Bank on digital AI for agriculture. A lot to talk about, but that's another talk right there. And finally, talent, because of that demographic factor that I talked about. Ethiopia alone graduates 250,000 STEM graduates every year. It's a little bit by design because the government adopted a strategy about 15 years ago that 70% of university students had to be in STEM. So there's the largest number of engineers entering the job market than anywhere else in Africa. So that is a massive amount of talent. Now, how well they're trained, we can quibble about all of that. But right now there's 30% of Y Combinator cohort coming from Africa. So Africa's talent is getting better and growing. So harnessing that is obviously going to be the key priority. And I believe I'll stop there. Thank you very much. The future is Africa.